The dusty Montana air felt deceptively peaceful. 9 months patching up torn bodies under fire in Syria had made me crave this quiet. But as I stood amid the noisy Ward family reunion at Uncle Leonard's ranch, I realized this was a different kind of combat zone. Cousins asked polite, shallow questions about my army job. Then my father Harold boomed a laugh that cut through the chatter. "Still playing Soldier Eliza?" He scoffed loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tell them the truth, you're nearly 35 and you still haven't found a real, stable career." The polite laughter that followed felt like shrapnel. I was a major, a trauma surgeon with years of blood and leadership under my belt, and he saw a failing child. "Why don't you make yourself useful?" he added, gesturing to the kitchen tent, "and go help the women with the dishes. That's about your speed." Have you ever been laughed at by people who had no idea who you really were? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories about standing up for yourself resonate with you, consider liking and subscribing. The laughter from the reunion still echoed in my ears, but it was a sound I had been conditioned to endure since childhood. Growing up in the Ward household meant living under the shadow of my father's narrow definition of success. For Harold Ward, reputation was the only currency that mattered, and that reputation was built on the backs of his children. My brother Daniel was the golden boy. From the moment he could walk, he was groomed to take over the family's construction business. Every time he secured a small contract or closed a real estate deal, my father would beam with a pride that I never once felt directed toward me. Then there was Claire, my younger sister. She was the family's perfect daughter pursuing a career in elementary education. My father praised her constantly for choosing a path that was fitting for a lady, stable, nurturing, and socially acceptable in our small Montana circle. I, however, was the anomaly. While Claire played with dolls, I spent my afternoons in the woods behind our ranch, fascinated by the intricate biology of the world. I collected specimens, studied the anatomy of fallen birds, and buried myself in thick science textbooks I'd borrowed from the local library. I didn't want a fitting career. I wanted to understand the mechanics of life and death. I wanted to heal. The first major fracture in our relationship occurred during my senior year of high school. We were sitting at the heavy oak dining table, the same table where my father dictated the rules of our lives, when I finally told him I intended to study medicine and join the army. The silence that followed was suffocating. Harold didn't just disagree, he was insulted. He slammed his hand against the table, the silverware rattling like a warning. "A doctor," he scoffed. "Eliza, you have the grades for a nice nursing program here in town. That's plenty for a woman. But the army, that's no place for a girl. You'll be nothing but a liability in a war zone surrounded by men who have more important things to do than babysit you." He saw the military as a dirty, brutal world that would tarnish the Ward name if a daughter entered it. To him, my ambition wasn't a sign of strength. It was a personal affront to his authority. He believed a woman's place was to be seen and not heard, or, at the very least, to be safely tucked away in a classroom or an office, not in a field hospital or a muddy trench. But I had already made my choice. I had applied for a military medical scholarship in secret, and when the acceptance letter arrived, I didn't ask for his permission. I simply packed my bags. The day I left for university, my father didn't help me load my car. He stood on the porch, arms crossed, his face a mask of disappointment. He didn't see a future surgeon leaving to serve her country. He saw a disobedient child throwing away a perfectly good life for a whim. From that moment on, he began the narrative that would define my image in the family for the next decade. "It's just a phase," he told our neighbors. "Eliza's going through her rebellious stage. She'll grow out of this soldier nonsense once she realizes how hard the real world is." He refused to acknowledge my hard work. While I was pulling 48-hour shifts in medical school and undergoing grueling physical training, my father was busy telling everyone at the local diner that I was finding myself, or drifting. He turned my sacrifice into a joke, a youthful indiscretion that he hoped would eventually end in my failure. He waited for me to come crawling back, admitting he was right. But every year I stayed in every rank I earned only made him dig his heels in deeper. To Harold Ward, I wasn't an officer or a doctor. I was just the daughter who refused to follow the script, and in his world that made me a failure, he had to hide behind a mask of mockery. The transition from medical school to active service was a baptism by fire. While my sister Claire was decorating her first classroom and Daniel was learning the ropes of the family business, I was stationed at a forward operating base in the Helmand province of Afghanistan. The quiet ranch life of Montana felt like a dream from another lifetime. My reality was the rhythmic thrum of medevac rotors and the metallic scent of blood that never seemed to leave my nostrils. As a trauma surgeon in a field hospital, settling down meant staying awake for 36 hours straight, kneeling in the dirt to keep a 19-year-old private from bleeding out. I performed surgeries under the hum of generators, sometimes with the distant rattle of gunfire providing a grim soundtrack. I saw the absolute worst of humanity, but I also saw the most incredible displays of courage. Each life saved was a victory that my father could never comprehend. To him, I was just away. To the men and women on my operating table, I was the only thing standing between them and a flag-draped coffin. While I was fighting to save lives abroad, a different kind of struggle was unfolding back home. The economic downturn had hit Montana hard, and the Ward family's small construction empire began to crumble. My father's pride wouldn't let him admit it, but the letters from my mother grew increasingly frantic. The bank was circling their property, and Daniel's real estate ventures were failing before they even started. I was earning a steady, significant officer's salary supplemented by combat pay and hazard bonuses. I had no expenses in the desert. I lived in a tent and ate MREs. So I did what any daughter would do. I sent the money home. Every month, thousands of dollars moved silently from my military pay account to my parents' joint bank account. I didn't ask for a thank you, and I certainly didn't want to hold it over them. I paid off the arrears on the ranch's mortgage. I quietly transferred enough to Daniel to cover the down payment on his first home disguised as an investment, so his ego wouldn't bruise. I was the silent foundation keeping the Ward family afloat, while I was thousands of miles away in a war zone. But pride is a poisonous thing. Harold Ward couldn't stomach the idea that the daughter he labeled a failure was the only reason he still had a roof over his head. Instead of gratitude, he chose erasure. During my rare satellite calls home, he would barely ask about my work. If I mentioned a difficult surgery or a commendation, he would grunt and change the subject to Daniel's potential or Claire's proper life. I later found out from a sympathetic aunt that during those years Harold was spinning a shameful web of lies to our relatives and the community in Bozeman. Eliza, he would say at the Sunday barbecues, nursing a beer while leaning against the truck my money had helped maintain. Oh, she's still just drifting around over there, drifting with the army. I think she's afraid of the real world, honestly. She'd rather wander in the desert than come home and get a real job. It's a shame, really. She's almost 30 and has nothing to show for it. He painted me as a nomad, a lost soul who joined the military because she couldn't hack it in the civilian world. He never told a soul that his mortgage was being paid by a major in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. He never mentioned that the wandering daughter was actually a highly specialized surgeon whose hands held the weight of lives every single day. I knew what he was doing. Every time I checked my bank balance and saw the deductions heading to Montana, I felt a bitter sting. I was providing the lifeblood for a family that refused to acknowledge I even had a pulse. I chose to stay silent partly out of a sense of duty, and partly because I hoped that one day the sheer weight of the truth would be enough to break through his denial. I didn't realize then that Harold Ward didn't just want to ignore my success, he wanted to bury it so deep that even he could believe his own lies. The promotions came with more responsibility, more sleepless nights, and the deepening weight of leadership. When I pinned on the silver bars of a captain and eventually the gold oak leaf of a major, the Army recognized my dedication. My commanding officers spoke of my surgical precision under fire and exemplary coolness in crisis. But to Harold Ward, these weren't milestones. They were merely new labels on a costume he refused to respect. I remember calling home the day I was promoted to major. It was a milestone that few achieve, especially at my age in the medical corps. I expected perhaps naively a flicker of fatherly pride. Instead, the line was met with a heavy, disinterested sigh. Major, huh? Harold's voice crackled over the long-distance connection. Sounds like just more paperwork and more time spent away from home. When are you going to stop playing this game and start a real-life Eliza? You're getting older. Those titles don't mean much in the real world. Whenever I took my rare leave to return to the ranch, the atmosphere was thick with his passive-aggressive mockery. I would arrive in my ACU's Army combat uniform, tired from 30 hours of travel, only for him to look me up and down with a smirk. "Back in your soldier suit again, I see." He'd chuckle at the dinner table. "You look like you're headed to a Halloween party, not a professional career. Doesn't the Army have any clothes that make you look like a doctor?" He went out of his way to strip the prestige from my work. If a neighbor asked about my service, he would jump in before I could utter a word. "Oh, Eliza's just a general practitioner for the boys over there. You know, bandages, flu shots, the basic stuff. She's not doing the heavy lifting like the surgeons in the big city hospitals." I would sit there, my fingers twitching, as I remembered the feel of a pulsating artery between my gloved hands or the smell of cauterized flesh in a chaotic trauma bay. I wasn't a basic doctor. I was a specialist who had performed thoracotomies in the back of moving helicopters. But in Harold's narrative, I was a glorified school nurse in a camo jacket. At family gatherings, the campaign of belittlement reached its peak. He would gather our relatives around and launch into his favorite monologue about stability. He'd point to Daniel, who was struggling but trying, or Claire, who was settled, and then turn his pitying gaze toward me. "We're all just waiting for Eliza to finally find her footing," he'd tell my aunts and uncles. "She's been jumping from one deployment to another because she's scared to face a real mortgage or a real boss. It's a shame to see someone with her education just drifting." It worked. I watched the expressions of my relatives shift over the years. The initial respect they had for my service was slowly replaced by a soft, condescending pity. They started asking me if I needed help looking for entry-level clinic jobs back in Montana. They'd offer me old furniture, assuming I lived out of a duffel bag because I couldn't afford a home. My father had successfully weaponized their concern, turning my high-stakes career into a tragic story of a woman who couldn't grow up. I realized then that this wasn't accidental. Harold wasn't just ignorant, he was deliberate. He needed me to be small so he could feel large. He needed my success to be a rebellious phase, because acknowledging my true status would mean admitting he had been wrong about me from the start. It would mean admitting that the daughter he sidelined was the most successful member of the family. I could have fought back. I could have brought my commendations, my pay stubs, and my surgical logs to the table and slammed them down. I could have told everyone that I was the one keeping the family ranch from the auction block, but I didn't. My grandmother, Nana Rose, was the only one who looked at me with genuine, quiet love. Her health was fragile, and she lived for these family reunions. She saw the tension, though. She didn't understand the technicalities of my rank. If I had started a war with my father, it would have shattered the fragile peace she cherished. For her sake, I swallowed the bile. I let the soldier suit jokes land. I let the relatives offer their pity. I retreated into the silence of a soldier who knows that the loudest man in the room is often the weakest. The occasion was Nana Rose's 75th birthday, a milestone that brought every branch of the Ward family tree back to the Montana ranch. The late afternoon sun bathed the fields in a deceptive gold, and the air was filled with the smell of roasting meat and the sound of forced laughter. I stood on the periphery wearing a simple linen dress trying to blend into the background. I had returned from the Middle East only days prior, the dust of the desert still seemingly etched into the creases of my palms, yet here I was, expected to play the role of the unsettled daughter. The celebration quickly turned into a stage for my siblings to perform their successes. Daniel stood near the buffet table, a beer in one hand, gesturing wildly as he detailed his latest real estate triumph. He'd sold a mid-sized ranch to a developer, a deal that unbeknownst to him had been salvaged only because I'd covered his personal credit line 3 months ago. My father stood beside him, nodding vigorously, his chest puffed out. "That's my boy," Harold boomed, "building the future of this county 1 acre at a time." Then came Claire's turn. She beamed as she announced her first pregnancy, passing around ultrasound photos like they were holy relics. The aunts cooed, praising her for completing the family circle. My father hugged her tightly, declaring that there was no higher calling than what Claire was doing. In his eyes, my siblings were the pillars of the Ward legacy, one building the walls, the other filling them with the next generation. Then inevitably, the spotlight shifted. Uncle Leonard turned to me, his brow furrowed with a sort of practiced concern. "And what about you, Eliza? Still with the army? We heard you were back, but we weren't sure if you were finally, looking for something permanent." Before I could even draw a breath to speak, Harold stepped into the gap. His voice was loud, carrying across the lawn to silence the other conversations. "Eliza." He laughed, a sharp, grating sound. "Oh, she's still in between things. The army's been a good place for her to hide, but let's be honest, she still hasn't found a real professional job. She's just marking time until she figures out what she wants to be when she grows up." A few of my cousins chuckled. They'd heard this script so many times that it had become a family gospel. To them, my 3 tours of duty were just a prolonged gap year. "Actually, Dad," I started, my voice low and steady. "Don't worry about it, honey," he interrupted, waving a hand dismissively as if shooing away a fly. "We don't need to talk shop today. In fact, since you don't have any business to attend to like Daniel, why don't you make yourself useful? Your mother and the aunts are swamped in the kitchen with the dessert service. Go on in and help with the dishes. It'll give you a chance to learn some skills you'll actually use one day." The humiliation was surgical. He hadn't just dismissed my career, he had relegated a field-grade officer and a specialized surgeon to the role of a kitchen maid in front of 30 people. He was suggesting that the hands that had sutured beating hearts were better suited for scrubbing gravy off plates. I looked around the circle. Some relatives looked away, embarrassed by the bluntness of it, but many others were smiling, caught up in the old-fashioned charm of Harold's patriarchal wit. They didn't see the major. They didn't see the doctor. They saw the failure Harold had meticulously painted for them over the last 15 years. My blood ran cold, a familiar sensation I usually reserved for the operating table when a patient's vitals began to plummet. It was the cold of absolute focus. I felt the sting of the insult, the raw burn of being erased by the man who should have been my fiercest advocate. But I also saw the calculation in his eyes. He had prepared this. He had waited for Nana's birthday, the one day he knew I wouldn't cause a scene, to deliver this final crushing blow to my dignity. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply looked him in the eye, my face a mask of military discipline. "Of course, Harold," I said, using his name instead of Dad for the first time in my life. The shift was subtle, but I saw him flinch. As I turned toward the house, I realized that the silence I had kept for Nana's sake was becoming a cage. My father hadn't just built a false image of me, he had built a monument to his own insecurity. I walked toward the kitchen, the weight of a decade of hidden truths pressing against my chest, waiting for the one thing that would finally shatter the glass house he had built. I stepped away from the sunlight and the suffocating weight of my father's gaze, retreating into the cool shadows of the ranch house kitchen. The porcelain sink was already overflowing with greasy plates, a mundane battlefield compared to the ones I had survived. I plunged my hands into the soapy water, the heat a sharp contrast to the cold fury simmering in my chest. I wasn't angry because Harold was wrong. I was angry because I had allowed him to define the silence I lived in. The screen door creaked open, then slapped shut. I didn't turn around assuming it was one of the aunts coming to supervise my domestic training. "You shouldn't be in here, Eliza." I turned to see my cousin Mark leaning against the doorframe. Mark was 10 years older than me, a quiet man who had served 2 tours in the Marines before returning to run a ranch 3 counties over. He looked at the dish towel in my hand, then up at my face with an expression of profound discomfort. "He's a piece of work, your old man," Mark said softly, stepping further into the room. "He's just being Harold." I replied, my voice flat. "He thinks he's protecting the family's image by pretending I'm a lost cause." Mark shook his head, a grim smile touching his lips. "It's more than that. I've seen your name, Eliza. I still have buddies at Landstuhl and a few in the medical corps. I know exactly who Major Eliza Ward is. I know about the commendation you received for that mass cal event in Kunduz. You're not just in the army. You're one of the best trauma surgeons they've got." I stayed silent, the water dripping from my fingers. Hearing my reality spoken aloud in this house felt like a foreign language. "You think we're all blind?" Mark continued, his voice dropping an octave. "A few of us, the ones who've actually worn the uniform we've known for years that Harold was full of it. You don't carry yourself like someone who's drifting. You have the eyes of someone who's seen the edge of the world and walked back. But Harold? He's spent years poisoning the well. Every holiday, every Sunday service, he drops these little comments painting you as this flighty, irresponsible girl. He's been so consistent that the people who don't know better, like Claire or the younger cousins, they just accepted it as truth. Nobody wanted to start a war with him, especially not at Leonard's place. It was easier to just nod and let him talk. The realization hit me harder than any physical blow. It wasn't just a father's misunderstanding. It was a calculated character assassination. Harold hadn't been hoping I'd find a real job. He had been actively working to ensure that even if I succeeded, no one in my homeworld would ever believe it. He had stolen my reputation to feed his own ego, making sure my light never outshone the small flickering candles of his favorite children. "I've sent them money, Mark." I whispered, the admission feeling like a betrayal of my own dignity. "I've paid the bills he couldn't. I bought Daniel's house." Mark's eyes widened, then hardened. "And he still stands out there and calls you a failure. That's not just pride, Eliza. That's malice." I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to walk out there and strip the lies away. But before I could move, a low, rhythmic vibration began to rattle the window panes. It started as a faint thrumming in the floorboards, a sensation I felt in my teeth, before I heard it with my ears. Mark tilted his head, his veteran's instincts kicking in. "That's heavy," he muttered. The sound grew with terrifying speed, a deep, visceral whoomp, whump, whump that drowned out the distant country music playing on the lawn. It was the sound of dual engines and massive rotor blades biting into the Montana air. This wasn't a local news chopper or a tourist flight. This was the sound of authority. I dropped the dish towel, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew that signature. I had heard it 1,000 times in the valleys of the Hindu Kush. "Is that—" Mark started, but I was already moving toward the door. We stepped out onto the porch, just as the shadow of a massive Black Hawk swept across the ranch, momentarily eclipsing the sun. The guests on the lawn were ducking their napkins and paper plates swirling into the air like white birds in a hurricane. In the center of the chaos stood my father, shielding his eyes, looking up at the sky with a mixture of confusion and fear. The dragon had arrived at the garden party. The roar of the engines was absolute. The Black Hawk didn't just approach, It dominated the landscape, banking sharply over the western ridge before hovering over the open pasture just 50 yards from the party. The downdraft was immense, a localized hurricane that sent Uncle Leonard's expensive patio umbrellas tumbling across the grass and whipped the tablecloths into a frenzy. The music died. The laughter died. Every head turned toward the sky as the massive matte black machine flared its nose and settled onto the turf with a heavy, purposeful grace. The dust cloud began to settle, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. My family stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer intrusion of high-stakes reality into their sheltered world. I saw Daniel drop his beer, the glass shattering unnoticed at his feet. I saw Claire clutching her husband's arm, her mouth hanging open in genuine shock. And I saw Harold. My father was pale, his eyes darting from the helicopter to me, his brain clearly struggling to reconcile this display of power with the drifting daughter he had just ordered to wash the dishes. The side door of the helicopter slid open. A man stepped out, his boots hitting the Montana soil with a deliberate crunch. He was in full Class A uniform, his brass gleaming even through the lingering dust. As he adjusted his cover and began walking toward us, I recognized him immediately. Dr. Ethan Cross, a high-ranking medical officer I had worked with during the evacuation of Kabul. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He didn't look at the ranch house, the birthday decorations, or the stunned relatives. His eyes were locked on me. He marched across the lawn with the rhythmic, unbreakable stride of a man on a mission of national importance. He stopped exactly 3 paces in front of me. To the horror and bewilderment of my father, the officer snapped his heels together and brought his hand to his brow in a crisp, sharp salute. "Major Ward!" He barked, his voice carrying clearly over the dying whine of the turbines. I stood tall, my spine straightening instinctively. The linen dress I wore suddenly felt like a dress uniform. I returned the salute with the precision of 15 years of service. "Colonel Cross, what is the meaning of this?" "Forgive the intrusion, Major," he said, lowering his hand but maintaining a stiff professional posture. "But the Pentagon needs you immediately. We have a Tier 1 medical emergency involving a special operations team currently in transit to a secure facility. You are the only vascular surgeon within 6 states with the specific field experience required for this type of trauma. The Secretary has authorized an immediate extraction." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered wards. The words Pentagon Major and the Secretary hung in the air like live wires. "I'm on leave, Colonel," I said, though I was already mentally calculating the contents of my go-bag. "Your leave has been revoked by order of the Surgeon General," Cross replied firmly. "The birds are fueled and waiting. We have a surgical suite prepped and in the air. We need your hands, Eliza. People are going to die if we aren't at altitude in 5 minutes." I looked past the colonel at my family. It was a tableau of total psychological collapse. My aunts were whispering Major to one another in hushed, terrified tones. My cousins were looking at me as if they were seeing a ghost, but it was Harold's face that stayed with me. He looked small. For the first time in my life, the man who had loomed over me like a mountain looked like a heap of dust. He was staring at the colonel's silver eagles, then at the way a superior officer addressed me with a level of deference Harold hadn't shown me in 20 years. The realization was hitting them all at once. I wasn't the failure. I wasn't the wanderer. I was a vital asset to the most powerful military on Earth, so indispensable that they would land a multi-million-dollar aircraft in a cow pasture just to fetch me. "I understand," I said, my voice echoing the colonel's authority. "Give me 2 minutes to grab my kit." I didn't ask for permission. I didn't look at the dishes in the sink. I walked past my father, who was trembling slightly, his mouth working but no sound coming out. The soldier suit wasn't a joke anymore. The reality of my life had finally collided with his lies, and the lies were being crushed under the weight of those rotor blades. The silence that followed Colonel Cross's declaration was more suffocating than the dust kicked up by the Black Hawk. Harold stood frozen, his face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray that matched the gravel under his boots. The glass of bourbon he'd been holding tilted dangerously in his hand, a few drops spilling onto his polished shoes, the shoes I had paid for. He looked like a man watching his entire reality dissolve in real time. Behind him, the wall of family solidarity began to crack. The whispers started small at first, then rising like a tide. "Major!" I heard Aunt Sarah hiss, her voice sharp with confusion. "Harold, you said she was just a technician. You said she couldn't keep a job." "A vascular surgeon," Uncle Leonard muttered, stepping forward to get a better look at the officer who was still standing at attention before me. "Harold, you told us she was drifting. The Pentagon doesn't send a Black Hawk for someone who's drifting." The questions began to rain down on my father from all sides. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a dawning realization that they had been fed a diet of lies for over a decade. They looked at the colonel, then at the massive machine idling on their grass, and finally at me. The condescension that had defined the afternoon, the pitying smiles, the offers of entry-level help vanished, replaced by a profound, heavy shame. It was a collective embarrassment. Every relative who had laughed at Harold's jokes or nodded when he called me a failure now felt the sting of their own ignorance. They realized they hadn't been worrying about a lost daughter. They had been mocking a woman who was at that very moment more essential to the world than any of them could imagine. I didn't participate in the interrogation. I didn't need to. I walked past the huddle of confused relatives and headed straight for the house. My movements were surgical, efficient, and devoid of wasted emotion. In my room, I swapped my linen dress for my flight suit and boots. I grabbed my tactical medical kit and my orders. When I stepped back onto the porch, the crowd had shifted. They were standing in a semicircle, keeping a respectful distance from the colonel and the helicopter, but their eyes were fixed on me. Harold tried to step forward. His lips moved, perhaps trying to form an excuse or a belated apology, but no words came. He looked pathetic. The man who had spent 34 years trying to make me feel small was now dwarfed by the consequence of my life. He looked at my flight suit, the soldier suit he had mocked an hour ago, and finally saw the authority it represented. I walked toward the Black Hawk without saying a word. I didn't shout. I didn't throw the mortgage payments in his face. I didn't point out the hypocrisy of a man who took my money while trashing my name. To reproach him now would be to give his lies more weight than they deserved. As I reached the edge of the pasture, I paused and looked back one last time. I saw my mother weeping silently into her apron. I saw Daniel looking at the ground, unable to meet my eyes. And I saw Harold standing alone in the center of the lawn, a king whose throne of lies had just been blown away by a rotor wash. I turned my back on them and climbed into the bay of the helicopter. Colonel Cross followed the door, sliding shut with a heavy thud that signaled the end of my life as the ward failure. As the engines roared to a higher pitch and we lifted off, the ranch shrank beneath us until it was nothing more than a tiny, insignificant dot in the vast Montana wilderness. The roar of the Black Hawk faded into the distance, but the silence it left behind at the ranch was explosive. As the dust settled on the ruined party, the collective shock of the Ward family curdled into a cold, sharp resentment directed at one man, Harold. The questioning began before the helicopter was even out of sight. Aunt Sarah was the first to break the dam. "Harold, you stood there and told us she was a failure," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "You told us she was drifting. That woman just got summoned by the Pentagon. Since when is saving lives for the Department of Defense considered not having a real job?" As the interrogation intensified, the secrets Harold had buried so deep began to bleed out. My mother, Margaret, unable to maintain the facade any longer under the piercing gaze of her sisters, finally broke down. The truth spilled out like water from a burst pipe. She admitted that the ranch had been months away from foreclosure until I intervened. She revealed that the investment Daniel used for his house had come from my combat pay. The shift in the yard was palpable. Harold's prestige, carefully cultivated over decades as the wise patriarch, disintegrated in an afternoon. To his peers, he was no longer the successful businessman with a wayward daughter. He was a man who had survived on his daughter's sacrifice while systematically trying to destroy her reputation. The cousins he had lectured about stability now looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. He had become the very thing he feared most, a fraud. For the first time in his life, Harold was forced to confront the void where his knowledge of me should have been. He realized he didn't know the names of the medals I'd won, the cities where I'd served, or the specific medical miracles I performed daily. He had been so busy building a cage for me that he never noticed I had built an empire. 2 weeks later, my phone buzzed while I was in the sterile quiet of a military hospital in Germany. I saw his name on the screen and waited 3 rings before answering. Eliza. He started, his voice sounding thinner, older. There was no booming laughter this time. I've been talking to some of the guys at the VFW. They asked what exactly it is you do. I realized I didn't know what to tell them. I didn't know how to explain your work to my friends. It was a classic Harold apology framed around his own social standing rather than the pain he'd caused. He was still worried about how to talk about me. It's not complicated, Harold. I replied, my voice cool and professional. I'm a surgeon. I save soldiers so they can go home to their families. I didn't understand the scope of it. He stammered. I thought it was different. Ignorance is not a license for cruelty, I said, cutting through his excuses. The fact that you didn't understand my world didn't give you the right to try and diminish it. You didn't lack information, Harold. You lacked respect. I ended the call before he could respond. The redemption he wanted wasn't something I could give him over the phone. He had spent years tearing me down. He was going to have to spend a lot more than 5 minutes learning how to build me back up. The following year, I stood on the parade deck at Fort Belvoir, under a sky so clear it looked like glass. The air was thick with the scent of starched shoe polish and the quiet dignity of a military tradition that spanned centuries. I was there to receive the Distinguished Service Cross for my actions during that Tier 1 mission, the one that had whisked me away from the Montana ranch in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash. For the first time, I had invited my family to witness my world. They sat in the front row, looking like fish out of water. Daniel was fidgeting with his tie, and Claire was clutching her newborn son. But it was Harold who drew my attention. He sat perfectly still, his eyes wide as he watched hundreds of soldiers snap to attention at the command of a general. He watched as seasoned officers, men with chests full of ribbons and faces etched with the scars of a dozen conflicts, walked up to me before the ceremony began. They didn't see the drifting daughter. They saw a lifesaver. They shook my hand with a reverence that clearly unsettled him, thanking me for the nights I had spent elbow-deep in their brothers in arms. As the general pinned the medal to my uniform, citing the unwavering courage and surgical mastery of Major Eliza Ward, I looked at my father. The man who had once told me I'd be nothing but a liability in a war zone was now weeping silently. He wasn't crying out of sadness, but out of the sheer crushing weight of his own error. He finally saw the magnitude of the life I had built in the silence he had tried to fill with mockery. After the ceremony, during the reception, Harold stood among my colleagues. He heard the stories they told, the ones I had never shared at the dinner table. He heard about the makeshift ORs, the courage under fire, and the respect I commanded from everyone in the chain of command. He eventually pulled me aside, but he didn't wait for us to be alone. He gathered my mother, Daniel, and Claire around us. His voice was thick, lacking its usual gravelly bravado. Eliza, he said, his eyes red-rimmed. I spent years trying to make you small because I was too small to see how big you actually were. I lied to our family and I lied to myself. I am so deeply sorry for the way I treated you. I didn't deserve a daughter like you. The apology didn't erase a decade of humiliation. it didn't wash away the memory of the soldier suit jokes or the laundry list of insults. I wasn't going to forget, but as I looked at him now, just an aging man seeking forgiveness from a woman he no longer controlled, I chose to let the resentment go. Later that evening, as we walked toward the parking lot, an old friend from the Pentagon stopped us to offer his congratulations. Harold didn't hesitate this time. He didn't look for a way to pivot the conversation to Daniel's real estate or Claire's teaching. He stood up straight, put a hand on my shoulder, not to push me down, but to stand beside me, and spoke with a clarity and pride that resonated across the pavement. "Thank you, Colonel," Harold said firmly. "We're incredibly proud. This is my daughter, Major Eliza Ward.